When Vivienne Harrington pushed me onto a plane bound for Dubai, she could not hide the cold little smile at the corner of her mouth. To her, I was nothing but a single father from the operations floor, useful enough to carry blame, never polished enough to sit inside a billion-dollar room. I understood exactly what the trip was. Fail, and I would be finished. Then, in a glass tower above the desert, a billionaire named Graham Ashford saw my face, rose from his chair, walked past an entire executive delegation, and asked one question that emptied the air out of the room. Does your CEO know who you are? If you enjoy the kind of reversal that leaves an arrogant person with nothing left to say, stay with me until the very last line. The Harrington Meridian Systems Tower stands on the north bank of the Chicago River, 41 floors of tinted glass that turn the color of gunmetal in November. I had worked there 6 years as a senior operations analyst, which is a title people use when they want your answers without owing you anything. My office was on the 11th floor, a floor nobody visited unless a warehouse was on fire. I wore the same 3 gray suits in rotation, carried a leather folder stuffed with reports covered in my own handwriting, and wore an old watch my wife had given me before she died. I liked the 11th floor. It was quiet, and quiet is where you notice things. That November, the entire company was orbiting a single deal. Harrington Meridian wanted a partnership worth $1.3 billion with Ashford Global Logistics, a joint build of an intelligent distribution network across the Middle East, anchored in the Emirates and reaching outward through 3 continents. Every internal memo called it the future of the firm. Every quarterly projection leaned on it like a man leaning on a cane. And for 3 straight months the negotiation had gone nowhere at all, stalled in a fog of revised term sheets and polite delays from the other side. Nobody upstairs seemed to understand why, which told me something in itself. On the 4th Tuesday of that month, they called me up to the 38th floor to present a technical annex. I had spent 11 days inside the proposal, not the summary version that circulated in slide decks, but the underlying model, the capacity tables, the throughput assumptions, the fine print in the exclusivity language. What I found was not a rough edge. It was 3 separate cracks running through the foundation, and every one of them pointed in the same direction. I printed the evidence, tabbed it, and rode the elevator up with the folder against my chest, and I remember thinking that this was going to be a difficult morning for everybody, including me. The conference room on 38 had a table cut from a single slab of walnut and a view that made people forget they were employees. 12 executives sat around it. Vivienne Harrington sat at the head, 47 years old, 3rd generation of the family whose name was carved into the lobby floor, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. She was genuinely intelligent. I have never pretended otherwise. But she had grown up inside a world where the room came to her, and somewhere along the way she had stopped being able to tell the difference between a person's rank and a person's worth. I presented for 9 minutes. First, the transport capacity figures in our proposal were inflated by roughly 18% against what our own systems had ever sustained under load. Second, the exclusivity clause locked Ashford into us for a term so long, with so little risk carried on our side, that no serious counterparty would sign it. Third, and worst, our forecasting model was built on North American demand curves and applied without adjustment to a region with entirely different seasonal freight behavior, port congestion patterns, and customs cycles. I did not editorialize. I said that if we submitted this version, Ashford Global would decline it, and that the decline would probably come quickly, because the people on their side who checked such things were very good. Vivienne let the silence sit for a moment, the way certain people do when they want everyone to watch what happens next. Then she looked at my suit, actually looked at it, from the shoulders down to the shoes, and asked the room more than she asked me. Are you teaching me how to negotiate a billion-dollar transaction? 2 directors laughed. A third looked at the table. She told me my value lay in spreadsheets and warehouses, in inventory and freight lanes, and that the art of the deal belonged to people who understood how wealthy men think and what they respect. She said it pleasantly. That was the part that stung. I closed my folder and said nothing more, because there is no version of arguing in that room that ends well for a man on the 11th floor. I took the elevator down. I ate a sandwich at my desk and answered 4 routing tickets and called my daughter Paige, a college sophomore 2 states away, and let her talk about a professor she disliked for 11 full minutes without interrupting once. At 4:50 that afternoon, the message came through from the Emirates. Ashford Global was declining the current structure of the proposal. Their stated reasons were 3: overstated capacity, unbalanced exclusivity, and forecasting assumptions inappropriate to the region. I did not feel vindicated. I felt the floor tilt, because I had been in enough corporations to know what happens when a prediction comes true in front of people who mocked it. Somebody would have to absorb the failure, and the person who absorbs it is never the person who caused it. It is always the person whose absence would cost the least. By 6 o'clock, my phone rang with a summons back to 38, and when I walked in, the room had thinned to Vivienne, 2 senior vice presidents, and a lawyer who did not introduce himself. Vivienne looked at me for a long moment with an expression I could not immediately name, and then she smiled, and I understood that the expression had been calculation. "You seem to understand Ashford better than anyone in this building," she said. "So you'll fly to Dubai tomorrow and save the deal yourself." I could not adjust pricing. I could not amend a single clause of the term sheet. I could not sign, initial, or verbally commit to anything on behalf of the company. No attorney from our legal group traveled with me, which for a transaction of that size is not an oversight, but a decision. My name did not appear on the official executive delegation roster filed with the Emirates office. I asked the Deputy General Counsel, politely, in writing, for a limited negotiating mandate, and received a reply that said the matter was under review and would be revisited upon my return. From a 3-day rescue mission. Then came the part I did not learn about until much later, though I had guessed at its shape. Vivienne circulated a note to the board and the executive committee describing the situation in language that was technically accurate and structurally lethal. The proposal had been declined. An operations analyst had volunteered strong opinions about the transaction. That analyst had accordingly assumed responsibility for an alternative approach and was proceeding to the Emirates to pursue it. Nowhere did the note say that I had warned them in advance. Nowhere did it say that I had asked for authority and been refused. The file was being built while I packed a suitcase, and it was being built with my name on the outside of the folder. She called me into her office the evening before the flight. The room smelled faintly of cut lilies and the city glittered behind her in the early dark. She told me the arrangements had been made, the hotel booked, the introductions handled by people who knew how such introductions are handled. Then she said the sentence I have not forgotten. Dubai is a place where a man is measured the instant he walks through a door. People there can price you in 4 seconds. Try not to embarrass us. She meant that I did not belong to that world, that I would be recognized as an outsider on sight, and that the failure would therefore look natural to everyone watching. Paige called while I was folding shirts into a suitcase that had last been used for a funeral. She was 19, sharper than I had been at that age, and she had inherited her mother's habit of skipping past the small talk when something in my voice was off. She asked whether I had done something wrong. I told her no, and then I told her the truth as plainly as I could, that sometimes an organization needs a person to hold the blame, so that the people who made the decision do not have to. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "So don't take the blame for them," and something in my chest went very still, because that is exactly what I had been preparing to do out of pure institutional habit. The heat comes at you in Dubai like a hand laid flat against your face, even in November. Light came off the towers in sheets, and the road in from the airport ran between construction cranes, standing in rows like the masts of a fleet. Black cars idled in front of hotels with their drivers waiting beside the rear doors. Inside the lobby, the marble ran unbroken for 40 feet, and a man in a beautiful suit was closing a term sheet at a low table while a waiter set down coffee without making a sound. Somewhere in that city, a signature was moving hundreds of millions of dollars while I stood in line at reception with a garment bag over my shoulder. The heat comes at you in Dubai like a hand laid flat against your face, even in November, even at 8 in the morning. Light came off the towers in sheets, so bright the glass looked liquid, and the road in from the airport ran between construction cranes, standing in rows like the masts of a fleet. Black cars idled in front of hotels with their engines running and their drivers standing beside the rear doors. Everything moved with a kind of expensive quiet. Inside the lobby, the marble ran unbroken for 40 feet, and a man in a beautiful suit was closing a term sheet at a low table while a waiter set down coffee without making a sound. Somewhere in that city, a signature was moving hundreds of millions of dollars while I stood in line at reception with a garment bag over my shoulder. The clerk found my reservation and read my designation off the screen without any particular emphasis, because to him it was only a field in a database. Technical operations support, not delegate, not advisor, not member of the negotiating party. Support. My room was on the 9th floor, clean and small, facing an interior courtyard. 2 floors above me, in a suite with a private terrace, were Douglas Reyes and Martin Kell, executive vice presidents, both of whom had flown out a full day ahead of me on an itinerary I had never been informed of. They had a car, a scheduling contact inside Ashford Global, and a standing invitation to a dinner I did not know existed until I saw the confirmation on Kell's phone by accident. So I walked the length of that table and set a document down in front of every chair, one by one, in a tower where a billionaire was about to arrive, wearing the same gray suit I had worn to my wife's memorial service. I did not argue about it. There is a certain kind of pride that costs you more than it protects, and I had learned years earlier which kind that was. As I set down the last folder, Martin Kell came up beside me and said quietly, in the tone men use when they think they are being generous with advice, "Don't misread the plane ticket. Flying to Dubai doesn't mean you've joined our floor." I told him I had never once thought that, which was the truth, and he seemed satisfied by it, which told me everything about him. The session opened without Graham. His chief operating officer chaired the first hour, flanked by 2 systems engineers and a woman from their commercial group who took notes with a fountain pen. Reyes presented. Kell supported, and within 4 minutes I heard our capacity numbers read aloud into that room, exactly as they had been written before I ever raised an objection, unchanged, uncorrected, delivered with confidence to people who had already declined them once in writing. The 18% was still there. The exclusivity term was still there. The North American demand curve was still sitting underneath the Gulf forecast like a stone under a carpet. That was the moment the last piece of it clicked into place for me, sitting in a chair at the far end of the table with a glass of water I had not touched. Vivienne had never intended to fix the transaction. If the proposal was going to be revised, she would have sent a lawyer and a mandate. She had sent an analyst with no authority and a resubmission of the same rejected document, which meant she expected a second refusal, and a second refusal now had a name attached to it. She would tell the board that operations had been given its chance, and that operations had failed in the field. I was not there to save anything. I was there to be photographed at the scene of the accident. I was still holding that thought when the door at the far end of the room opened, and the air in the room changed the way air changes before weather. Graham Ashford walked in, 61 years old, silver-haired, jacket unbuttoned, holding nothing at all in his hands. Every person at that table stood up. His eyes moved along the row of faces with the neutral speed of a man who has been introduced to 10,000 people and remembers perhaps 40. Then they reached the end of the table, and they stopped, and they stayed. He did not greet Douglas Reyes. He did not greet Martin Kell, whose hand was already extended. He walked the entire length of that stone table without saying a word to anybody, past the chief operating officer, past the notes and the folders I had laid out 20 minutes earlier, and he stopped in front of my chair and looked at me for what felt like a very long time. Then something moved in his face, and he laughed, one short surprised sound. Caleb Rowan. 14 heads turned at once. I stood up, and I heard my own voice come out steadier than I expected. "Hello, Graham." We shook hands, and it was not the handshake of a vendor meeting a client. It was the handshake of two men who had once spent 3 days in the same room without sleeping while something enormous came apart around them. He asked me where in the world I had gone. I told him that life had changed direction, that I had chosen to stay close to my family, and that I had been perfectly content doing work that mattered even when nobody outside a warehouse ever heard about it. Douglas Reyes moved in fast, the way a man does when he senses a situation escaping him. "Mr. Ashford, Caleb is part of our operations support group. He's here to assist with data questions, if any come up." Graham turned his head slowly. "Support group," he repeated, not as a question exactly, and then he leaned over and read the small printed card sitting in front of my chair. "Technical operations support." He read it twice. Then he laughed again, and this time there was nothing warm in it at all, only disbelief, the sound a man makes when he is being told something absurd by people who do not know it is absurd. He reached out, pulled the empty chair beside his own away from the table, and said one word, "Sit." Nobody moved for a second. Then I picked up my folder and walked the length of the room in front of every executive who had watched me distributing documents, and I sat down at the head of the table beside the founder of Ashford Global Logistics. Martin Kell's face had gone the color of paper. Graham poured me water himself, which in that particular world is a sentence with no punctuation left to add. "Do you still remember Phoenix 12? He asked. It was a distribution center outside Mesa, the second facility in a network that had nearly destroyed him in the year the whole industry was retrenching. I said, "The bottleneck was in the third routing loop. Everything upstream tested clean, which is why nobody found it for 11 weeks. Graham brought his hand down flat on the table and laughed so loudly that the woman with the fountain pen jumped. 12 years, he said. He still has it. Then he turned and looked down the table at the delegation from Harrington Meridian, and his voice dropped into something flatter and more serious. "You all know the Rowan Protocol." Of course they did. Every operations professional in that room had learned it in some form. A two-tiered distribution architecture that separated predictive routing from load commitment, taught in graduate programs and stamped into the internal standards of half a dozen major carriers. Kell nodded automatically, the way you nod at a fact so slapstitched it barely registers as information. Graham let 2 full seconds pass. "The man who designed it is sitting at this table. Does your CEO know who you are?" I looked down at the folder in front of me, the one with the inflated capacity tables printed on page 9, and I gave him the only honest answer I had. "I think she knows my job title." Graham held my eyes for a moment. Then he reached over, closed the bound proposal in front of him, the document representing $1.3 billion and 3 months of negotiation and the entire future of my employer, and pushed it 8 inches away from himself across the stone. "I don't want to hear this presentation anymore," he said. He pointed at me. "I want to hear him. Graham, I need to be clear with you and with everyone here. I have no mandate to modify this agreement. I cannot alter pricing, terms, or scope. Anything I say is a technical opinion, not a company position, and it does not bind Harrington Meridian in any way. Douglas Reyes exhaled. Graham studied me for a moment, and then he nodded slowly, and I saw something settle in his expression that I recognized from 12 years earlier. He had always valued people who told him the boundaries of their own knowledge before they told him anything else. Understood, he said, then answer a hypothetical. If you did have the authority, what would you change? I stood up and walked to the screen at the end of the room. I had no prepared slides. I had 11 days of work in my head and a folder of annotations under my arm, and for the next 50 minutes, I took that transaction apart in front of the people who had built it. I started with capacity, because capacity is where every logistics agreement eventually dies. Our proposal committed to a sustained throughput our physical and software infrastructure had never once achieved outside a controlled simulation, roughly 18% above demonstrated performance. Not fraud, necessarily. Optimism compounded across 4 departments until nobody owned the total. But if Ashford signed it, the network would run beautifully for about a year and then begin to seize during peak cycles, and the reputational damage would land on both names equally. Second, exclusivity. The clause bound Ashford Global to our systems architecture for 8 years, with a termination penalty structured so that leaving early cost more than staying with a failing network. Meanwhile, our side carried almost no performance liability whatsoever. No service credits with teeth, no remedy that scaled with impact. I told Graham plainly that no counterparty with competent counsel would ever sign it, and that the length of the term was not confidence on our part. It was insurance against our own doubts about the technology. I could feel Kel staring at the back of my head. Third, the forecast. The model driving the entire capital plan used North American demand curves, holiday-weighted, tuned to the seasonal rhythm of a consumer market I had spent a decade studying. It had been applied to the Gulf with a currency conversion and nothing else. No adjustment for the freight patterns around religious calendars, no modeling of port congestion during the re-export surge, no accounting for the difference between a market that consumes and a market that transships. Every number downstream of that model, including the 18%, was resting on an assumption that had no business being there. Then I gave them the alternative, because criticism without construction is just noise, and I had never once brought a problem to Graham Ashford without bringing a shape for the answer. A 2-tier build, a committed core network sized to demonstrated capacity with hard performance guarantees attached, and an elastic secondary tier priced on actual utilization that could scale in 18-month increments as real regional data accumulated. Risk carried proportionally by both parties. Exclusivity reduced to 4 years and tied to performance thresholds rather than time. Forecasting rebuilt on regional inputs with a defined recalibration cycle. That's not the Rowan Protocol, he said when I finished. That's what the Rowan Protocol grew into. I told him the truth that I had kept developing it for years on my own time, in the evenings after my daughter went to bed, because I did not know how to stop thinking about systems, even when nobody was paying me to. Graham was quiet for a moment. Then he told the room that Ashford Global was not withdrawing from the transaction, and I watched Reyes and Kel both exhale at the same instant, 2 men who had just been handed their careers back. On one condition, Graham said. Caleb Rowan sits on the joint design team, and he holds technical veto over the final architecture. If he says the network can't carry it, the network doesn't carry it, and no one at your company overrides that. Kel said, carefully, that such an arrangement would require review at the executive level. Graham smiled without any warmth at all. Then review it, he said. I have a great deal of patience and $1.3 billion. You have neither. They called Chicago from the corridor before I had finished packing my folder. I could hear one side of it through the glass, Reyes's voice pitched into that flat, urgent register men use. when they are delivering news they know will be received badly. Vivienne did not congratulate anyone. She did not ask what the revised structure looked like, or what the veto covered, or whether the deal was safe. According to Reyes, who told me weeks later when it no longer cost him anything, she asked exactly one question, and she asked it twice to be certain of the answer. How much does Ashford know about Rowan's history? She scheduled the call for 11 at night, Dubai time, which was afternoon in Chicago, and she did not ask whether that was convenient. Before it began, Martin Kell knocked on my hotel door with 2 glasses of something amber and a proposition dressed as friendly advice. He suggested that when the call started, I keep the discussion focused on forward architecture. He suggested I not go into detail about Northline dynamics, about the early years, about the origin of the protocol. When I asked him why, he moved his glass around on the table for a while and said that legacy intellectual property questions were complicated and that nobody wanted complications. It was not an answer. It was the shape of an answer, laid over something else entirely. Vivienne came up on the screen at the end of the conference room, projected 9 feet tall, framed by the Chicago skyline going dark behind her. She looked composed, immaculate, entirely unbothered, and she opened by thanking Ashford Global for its continued engagement in a tone that suggested the past 12 hours had been a scheduling matter. When Graham noted that the session had been productive, largely because of my analysis, she did not miss a beat. Mr. Rowan was carrying out the assignment the company gave him, she said. We're pleased the framework we sent him with proved useful. I have replayed the next 90 seconds many times. Graham let her finish. Then he said, conversationally, Vivienne, are you familiar with the Rowan Protocol? She said of course she was. He asked whether she knew who created it, and there it was, a single beat of silence, 1 heartbeat too long, transmitted across 7,000 miles at 9 feet tall in front of 11 people. She recovered quickly, she always did. But Graham had his answer before she opened her mouth, and so did everyone else in that room. What she did next was the most revealing thing she had ever done in my presence. She went for ownership. Any technology developed within the Northline ecosystem, she said, along with all derivative methodologies, had passed through the acquisition chain and now belonged to the enterprise. And the company would naturally expect any related contribution to be handled within that framework. It was a threat wrapped in a corporate affairs sentence, and it was aimed squarely at me. She was telling me, in front of a billionaire, that my past was her property. I did not argue. That surprised her, I think. I said, that's correct. The intellectual property rights sit with the enterprise. I've never claimed them and I'm not claiming them now. The entire line of attack collapsed under its own weight, because she had prepared to fight a man trying to take something, and I was not taking anything. Graham set his hand flat on the table. This was never about a patent, he said. I'm talking about a person. Your company has one, and apparently it has no idea. Then he told them the part I had never told anyone at Harrington Meridian. 12 years earlier, 3 days before a launch carrying nearly $400 million of committed capital, I had found the defect in the 3rd routing loop that would have collapsed the entire chain under holiday load. But that was not why he remembered me. He remembered me because when the crisis passed, and he wanted to know who to reward and who to remove, I refused sole credit and asked him to keep the 4 engineers whose design had contained the flaw. He kept them. One of them was in the room. That's why I remember him, Graham said to the screen. Not because he was clever. Clever is cheap. Because when he had all the leverage in the room, he used it to protect people who had less. Vivienne said nothing. I could see the calculation moving behind her eyes. Not shame, never shame, but the pure arithmetic of a woman recognizing that the counterparty in a billion-dollar transaction now trusted her operations analyst more than he trusted her, and that every hour this continued, her position eroded further. She called me directly 40 minutes after the video ended. It was almost 1 in the morning, and I was standing at the window of my room watching the traffic move along the water. Her voice was different. Not warm. She was never capable of warm, but pitched into a register I had never heard from her. Reasonable and confiding and slightly rushed. She said she had reviewed my contribution. She said the company had clearly underutilized me for years, and that she intended to correct it personally. Then came the offer, and it was a real one. A promotion to vice president effective immediately upon my return. A base salary of more than 3 times what I was earning. A completion bonus tied to the closing of the Ashford transaction that would have paid for the rest of my daughter's education twice over and left something behind. She spoke about it fluently, the way people speak about money when they have always had it, as though the numbers were a courtesy rather than a lever. The conditions came last, folded in at the end where you would put something small. She would resume direct control of all negotiations with Ashford Global, and I would support rather than lead. And the internal record concerning the risk assessment would not be revisited. Specifically, I would not raise in any forum the fact that I had submitted formal warnings about capacity, exclusivity, and forecasting before the original proposal was sent, or that those warnings had been received and set aside. I stood there with the phone against my ear and the desert night outside and understood exactly what I was being offered. It was not a promotion, it was a payment for silence, structured as a promotion so that both of us could pretend otherwise afterward, and if I took it I would spend the remainder of my career as a man who could be bought once, which means a man who can be bought again. I thought about my daughter's voice on the phone before the flight. So don't take the blame for them. I said no. I said it plainly and without any speech attached, because speeches are what people give when they are trying to convince themselves. At 6:20 the next morning my laptop refused my credentials. I tried twice, then opened my phone and found an automated notice from Information Security stating that my access to internal systems had been suspended pending administrative review. 20 minutes after that came the message from Human Resources, 3 careful paragraphs advising me that the company was examining conduct potentially exceeding delegated authority in an international negotiation, that I should refrain from representing Harrington Meridian in any capacity, and that I would be contacted regarding next steps. Nowhere did the word termination appear. It did not need to. The isolation was immediate and almost impressive in its efficiency. Douglas Reyes did not answer 2 calls. When I arrived at the Ashford Tower for the 9 o'clock working session, Martin Kell met me in the elevator lobby and told me, without quite looking at me, that under the circumstances my participation was no longer appropriate, and that he would explain my absence to the other side. He said the word circumstances as though it were a weather event. I asked whether he was going to tell Graham Ashford that the person he had asked for by name had been removed overnight. Kell said arrangements would be handled at the appropriate level. So I went back to the hotel and packed. I did not call Graham. That mattered to me then, and it matters to me now, because the entire story would have been different and smaller if I had run to a billionaire for rescue. I had known Graham Ashford for 3 days 12 years earlier and 1 morning in a glass tower, and that is not a relationship you spend. I rebooked my flight for the following evening, sat down at the small desk by the window, and started writing a chronology of everything that had occurred, dates, times, names, in the flat unemotional style I had used in incident reports for 20 years. And while I was doing that, I remembered what Vivienne had forgotten. 11 days before the proposal was submitted, I had not simply mentioned my concerns in a meeting. I had filed a formal risk assessment through the compliance channel, as the company's own operations manual required for any material discrepancy in a customer-facing performance commitment. That document existed. It carried a system timestamp. It carried read receipts from 4 recipients, including 2 executives. It carried the digital countersignature of the compliance officer, who had logged it as received and open. And appended to the thread, in writing, was a response from the office of the chief executive instructing that these observations were not to be included in materials prepared for the board. I did not need to break into anything, or take a single confidential file. That was the beauty of it, and the whole point of the process I had followed. Under the company's own governance rules, any compliance filing-rated material with an unresolved status was mirrored into the board's audit repository automatically. It had been sitting there for weeks, untouched, in a system Vivienne did not control and could not quietly amend, waiting for somebody to have a reason to look. Meanwhile, 7 floors above the district, Graham Ashford had developed a problem of his own. Elena Vasquez, having spent an evening reconciling my presentation against the submitted proposal, had found something that stopped her cold. The sustained throughput figure in the document, formally delivered to Ashford Global, did not match the figure in the underlying technical annex from which it was supposedly derived. It was not a rounding difference or a definitional variance. Somewhere between the operations floor and the counterparty, a number had changed, and it had changed in the direction favorable to the seller. Graham Ashford did not accuse anybody of anything. I want to be precise about that, because the temptation to make him a hero is strong, and he was something better, careful. He wrote a 2-paragraph letter to the board of Harrington Meridian Systems, copied to the general counsel of both companies, stating that Ashford Global was suspending all negotiations on the joint distribution network effective immediately, and that discussions would not resume until the counterparty could identify who had approved the performance figures contained in the submitted proposal and confirm the process by which they had been validated. $1.3 billion stopped moving in the length of time it takes to press send. I was in a taxi on the airport road when my phone rang with a Chicago number I did not recognize, and a voice introduced itself as Harold Whitfield, chairman of the board of directors. He had not called Vivienne Harrington. He had called me, an analyst whose credentials had been suspended 11 hours earlier, and he asked me one question in a tone of profound and careful courtesy. "Mr. Rowan, can you tell us exactly what happened?" They convened the governance session for the following afternoon, and I attended by video from a rented conference room in a business center off Sheikh Zayed Road, wearing the same gray suit, with my chronology printed and my folder open. Vivienne attended from the 38th floor with the general counsel beside her. 7 directors, the chairman, and the peculiar reversal of a man who had been forbidden from entering a meeting room the previous morning, now speaking first, while the chief executive waited her turn. I did not attack her. I had decided that on the plane that never left, and I held to it, because in a room of that kind, the person who reaches for emotion loses the room to whoever stays cold. I presented 6 items in sequence. The date I identified the discrepancies, the date and channel of my formal risk filing, with the compliance reference number, the names of the 4 recipients, and the timestamps of their read receipts. The fact that the proposal was submitted without amendment regardless. The fact that I was dispatched to the Emirates to rescue the transaction while explicitly denied authority to modify any term of it. And the fact that my system access was suspended within 9 hours of Ashford Global requesting my formal inclusion on the design team. Vivienne's defense was competent, which was the frightening part. She said that operational personnel routinely raise concerns and that leadership's role is to weigh them against commercial judgment. She said the 18% figure represented an aspirational performance target consistent with industry practice. She said the suspension of my credentials was a standard protective measure after an employee engaged in unauthorized dialogue with a counterparty. Every sentence was defensible in isolation. Together they described a company where the warning was noise, and the warner was the threat. Harold Whitfield let her finish entirely. Then he took off his glasses and asked the question that ended it. "Mrs. Harrington, if Mr. Rowan lacked the standing to speak on this transaction, why did you send him alone to the Emirates to save it?" She began to answer and stopped. She began again. The general counsel looked at the table. 22 seconds passed, and I know the number because I was watching the clock in the corner of my screen, and in a boardroom 22 seconds is a geological era. The decisive blow did not come from me. Graham Ashford joined the call at the chairman's invitation, and he spoke for less than a minute. He said he was not asking the board to remove anybody, that governance of Harrington Meridian was entirely their affair, and that he had no interest in the internal politics of a partner. Then he paused for a moment and finished. "I will only say this. I am not placing $1.3 billion under the direction of an executive who suppressed a risk warning her own engineer filed through her own compliance system. That is not a judgment about her character. It is a judgment about my exposure." There was no shouting. Nobody was escorted anywhere by security. The board placed Vivienne Harrington under formal governance review, engaged outside counsel to examine the origin of the submitted figures, and stripped her of direct authority over the Ashford relationship pending the outcome. That is what consequence actually looks like at that altitude. Not handcuffs, but the quiet removal of the one thing she had built her entire identity upon, which was the right to decide. She sat there on the screen while it happened, perfectly still, and I felt no triumph at all. I felt tired. When it was done, Harold Whitfield turned to the camera and said the board wished me to lead the reconstituted negotiating team for the Ashford transaction, effective immediately, with the suspension of my access rescinded and a formal note of correction entered in my file. I thanked him. Then I said, "Before I accept, I have 3 conditions. The first condition was that no unverified performance figure would ever again appear in a proposal issued by the company. Every capacity commitment presented to a counterparty would be traceable to demonstrated data with a named engineer attached to its validation, and any aspirational target would be labeled as such in the document itself. This was not idealism. A company that lies about throughput eventually builds a network that cannot carry what it promised. And the bill for that arrives in the form of failed peak seasons and litigation. The second condition was that any member of a technical team could file a risk assessment directly to compliance, with automatic mirroring to the audit committee, and that no adverse employment action could be taken against that person for 90 days without board notification. I had survived because a filing I made had ended up somewhere she could not reach. The next person might not know the procedure existed. Protection should not depend on a man happening to read the operations manual 11 years earlier. The third condition was the one I had thought about for 3 days in a hotel room, and I stated it slowly. No employee who followed correct procedure would ever again be positioned to absorb the consequences of a decision made above them. If leadership overrode a documented technical warning, leadership would own the outcome in the record, by name, permanently. I had watched a memo being constructed around me in real time, and I wanted the architecture of that particular trick removed from the building. The board accepted all 3. There was some discussion about the second, mostly around notification timelines, and the general counsel asked for language adjustments to the third, but by the end of the session all of it was in the minutes. Graham was still on the line, and when it concluded he laughed and said, 12 years. And you're still the most inconvenient man in any room you walk into. I told him that was probably why I would never be a chief executive. He was quiet for a beat, or exactly why you should be. They did not make me chief executive. I want to be honest about that, because the fantasy version of this story ends with the analyst in the corner office, and the fantasy version is a lie about how institutions work. What the board offered 3 weeks later, and after a compensation committee review, was Senior Vice President of Systems Strategy, with direct architectural authority over the Ashford build, a standing reporting line to the Audit Committee on Technical Risk and Equity that meant something. It was a real job with real scope that matched what I could actually do, and I took it. The internal investigation ran 6 weeks, and its findings were narrower and more damning than any personal grievance could have been. Vivienne Harrington resigned as Chief Executive Officer of Harrington Meridian Systems on a Thursday in February, with a statement about pursuing other opportunities that fooled precisely nobody in the industry. She did not fall because she had humiliated an analyst in a conference room. Corporations do not remove people for cruelty. She fell for 4 specific documented things. She had received a material risk filing through the compliance system and instructed that its contents be excluded from board materials. Unverified performance data had been transmitted to a counterparty under her authority. The internal record showed a pattern consistent with pre-positioning accountability onto a subordinate before an anticipated failure, and a strategic transaction representing a meaningful fraction of the company's projected growth had been placed in jeopardy as a direct result. 4 lines in a report. That is all it takes when the lines are true. She asked to see me before she left the building, and we met in the same room on the 38th floor with the walnut table and the November light, except it was February now and there was nobody else in it. She looked exactly the same. That was the strange thing. Whatever had happened to her had not touched the surface at all. She stood by the window for a while, and then she asked the question she had presumably been carrying for months. Why did you never tell anyone you created the Rowan Protocol? I gave her the true answer. Because I believed the work I do now should be judged by the work I do now. I told her the past was not a credential I wanted to lean on, only a thing that had happened to a younger man with a different life. You understand everything would have been different if I had known, she said. And there it was, offered almost as an apology, and containing within it the entire reason she had lost. I looked at her for a moment. That, I said, is exactly the problem. She had not failed to respect me because she lacked information about my history. She had failed to respect me because she was incapable of valuing a person until somebody wealthier than her did it first. Every judgment she had ever made about a human being had been outsourced to a status signal. 3 months after that, on a morning in May, the Ashford Global and Harrington Meridian Agreement was signed in a room 44 floors above Business Bay. The final structure carried a committed core network sized to demonstrated capacity, an elastic second tier priced on utilization, mutual performance liability, a 4-year exclusivity term tied to service thresholds, and a forecasting model rebuilt entirely on regional data with a 12-month recalibration cycle. The headline value was still above $1 billion. It was simply a number that could survive contact with reality, which the previous one could not. I did not move to the Emirates. Graham offered me something extraordinary about a month before the signing, a global role at Ashford with a compensation package I had to read twice, and I turned it down for a reason that took me about 4 seconds to reach. Paige had 2 years of college left and a habit of calling on Sunday evenings, and I had already missed enough by working late in a building where nobody knew what I had built. I told Graham I would run the architecture from Chicago and fly out when the network needed me. He said that was the most predictable decision I had ever made, and that he would have been disappointed by anything else. At the signing, I sat at Graham's right hand, in a chair that had been assigned by name on a printed card, in the same room where I had once laid documents at 32 seats. Harrington Meridian's new chief executive, a woman named Ruth Ellery, who had come up through operations herself, sat across from me and had read every page of the technical annex, which told me more about the company's future than any press release could. A young executive from our side, 3 weeks into the job, asked Graham how long the two of us had known each other. Graham looked at me and laughed. 12 years, he said. I'm only surprised it took his company this long to find out what it had. Afterward, the room emptied, and the two of us stood at the glass with the city laid out below, the towers going gold, the cranes still turning out toward the desert, the traffic moving along the water in slow, bright lines. Graham held his coffee and did not say anything for a while, which is a thing men of that age have earned the right to do. Then he asked it again, the same question, in almost the same voice as the morning it had frozen 14 people in their chairs. So, does your CEO finally know who you are? I looked down at the contract folder in my hands, at the architecture page, with my signature at the bottom, the one page in $1.3 billion of paper that could not be signed by anybody else in the building. I thought about a woman telling me to stick to spreadsheets and warehouses, about a coordinator handing me a stack of documents to distribute, about a hotel room at 1 a.m. and an offer designed to buy my silence, and about a 19-year-old telling her father not to take the blame for people who had earned it themselves. I smiled. Now they know.